October 10, 1943. High above northern Germany, the sky is painfully clear. 10,000 feet below, the Baltic coastline lies cold and distant. At 25,000 feet, 8 American B-17 flying fortresses move in tight formation, engines droning in a steady mechanical rhythm. Frost gathers along the inside of plexiglass panels. Oxygen masks hide young faces. They were not meant to be alone. Minutes earlier, the larger formation had fractured under flak bursts and climbing fighters. Now only 8 bombers remain together, a small, rigid box of aluminum and resolve cutting across hostile airspace. On the horizon, dark specks begin to rise. Messerschmitt Bf-109s. Focke-Wulf 190s. Climbing fast. Sunlight flashes off wings as they position for attack. The German interception has been timed perfectly. Inside the lead aircraft, gunners scan their sectors. Waist guns pivot. Top turrets rotate. No one speaks more than necessary. 8 bombers. Surrounded. Deep over enemy territory. And the Luftwaffe is closing in. By October 1943, the air war over Europe had entered a brutal phase. The United States Army Air Forces believed in daylight precision bombing. It was not a symbolic idea. It was doctrine. Factories, rail yards, ball-bearing plants, aircraft assembly lines, these were the arteries of Nazi Germany's war machine. Strike them in daylight, with precision, and the war could be shortened without the devastation of entire cities. The British had already learned the cost of daylight raids in 1940 and 1941. Their bombers suffered catastrophic losses against German fighters and anti-aircraft defenses. The RAF shifted to night bombing. Safer. Broader. Less precise. The Americans chose another path. The Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress became the symbol of that decision. First flown in the 1930s, hardened through early war experience, it was built for altitude and endurance. For Wright R-1820 Cyclone engines. A cruising altitude above 25,000 feet. A range that allowed deep penetration into occupied Europe. But its defining feature was not its range. It was its guns. By 1943, the B-17G model carried up to 13.50 caliber Browning machine guns. Nose guns. Dorsal turret. Ball turret beneath the fuselage. Waist guns. Tail guns. The idea was simple: fly in tight formation, overlap fields of fire, and create a defensive wall of .50 caliber tracers that no fighter could easily penetrate. This was the combat box. Bombers were stacked in staggered tiers, high, low, left, right, so that every approach vector was covered by multiple guns. A lone B-17 was vulnerable. A group was supposed to be self-defending. That was the theory. In practice, the Luftwaffe adapted quickly. By 1943, Germany's air defense network had matured into a coordinated system. Radar stations along the coast detected incoming formations while they were still over the North Sea. Controllers tracked bomber streams and directed fighter units with precision timing. Jägerschwader, fighter wings equipped with Bf-109s and Fw-190s, were scrambled to calculated interception points. The sky above Germany was no longer open airspace. It was layered defense. First came the flak belts. Heavy 88mm anti-aircraft guns ringed major industrial centers. Timed shells burst in black clouds at bomber altitude. Not aimed at a single aircraft, but at the formation itself. Shrapnel tore through aluminum skin, control cables, oxygen lines. If a bomber dropped out of formation, it became exposed. Then came the fighters. German pilots understood that attacking from the rear, once the standard method, was costly. The B-17's tail guns were lethal. So they evolved. Head-on passes became common. Fighters would dive toward the formation at closing speeds exceeding 600 miles per hour, firing 20mm cannon shells directly into the bomber's nose, the most vulnerable section before the chin turret was introduced. The exchange lasted seconds. But seconds were enough. Losses mounted steadily through mid-1943. Missions to Bremen, Kiel, Hamburg. Then the deep strikes into central Germany, Regensburg and Schweinfurt in August 1943. On those raids, American bombers flew beyond the range of Allied fighter escort. P-47 Thunderbolts could not yet accompany them all the way in. The result was devastating. On the second Schweinfurt raid, October 14, 1943, 4 days after the mission over Münster, the 8th Air Force would lose 60 B-17s in a single day. Nearly 600 men killed, wounded, or captured. It became known as Black Thursday. The events over Münster, just days earlier, were part of that same dangerous arc. Escort fighters could protect bombers only for part of the journey. Beyond that invisible line, the bombers were alone. Deep inside German airspace, interception was not random. It was inevitable. And once a formation began to fragment under flak and repeated attack, survival depended on discipline. A tight box could survive. A broken group might not. Which is how, on October 10, 1943, 8 B-17s found themselves separated from the main body, still over Germany, still within range of every interceptor base in the region, and directly in the path of a coordinated Luftwaffe response. Because to understand what happened next, it is necessary to understand how German interception tactics had evolved by late 1943. By late 1943, the Luftwaffe no longer relied on scattered, reactive defense. It operated as a system. From coastal radar stations in the Netherlands and northern Germany to inland command centers, the German air defense network, known as the Kammhuber Line in its earlier form, had evolved into a layered detection and response grid. Though originally designed for night interception, its principles influenced daylight coordination as well. Radar operators tracked bomber streams as they crossed the North Sea. Plotters marked altitude, heading, and estimated targets. Orders moved quickly through radio channels. Fighter units did not scramble blindly. They climbed toward predicted interception points. The Messerschmitt Bf 109 remained the backbone of Germany's fighter force. Fast in the climb. Agile. Armed typically with 20mm MG 151 cannons and 7.92mm machine guns. Alongside it, the Focke-Wulf FW-190 brought heavier firepower and a more stable gun platform. Some variants carried underwing rockets, 21cm Wurfgranit projectiles, designed to disrupt bomber formations before the fighters closed in. The goal was not merely to shoot down one aircraft. It was to break the box. Once a formation lost cohesion, overlapping defensive fire weakened. Gaps opened. Individual bombers became isolated. And isolated bombers died quickly. German tactics reflected this logic. Head-on attacks became standard practice. Fighters approached from 12 o'clock high, firing cannons into the nose and cockpit area where armor protection was limited. The closing speed reduced exposure time to defensive guns. A well-placed burst could kill pilots, shatter the nose, or ignite fuel lines. Other pilots attacked from below and slightly ahead, a blind spot difficult for waist gunners to cover. Some coordinated in waves. One element attacked to force gunners to focus forward. A second element rolled in from the flank. The sky turned into geometry. Every angle calculated. Every second measured. Yet the Luftwaffe faced its own pressures. Fuel shortages were beginning to strain operations. Experienced pilots were irreplaceable. The Eastern Front consumed aircraft and manpower at a relentless pace. And American production numbers were staggering. Factories in Seattle, Long Beach, and Wichita produced bombers faster than Germany could destroy them. Still, in the autumn of 1943, the balance in daylight skies over Germany remained deadly for the attackers. Escort fighters were the missing piece. The P-47 Thunderbolt could escort bombers partway, but its range limited protection deep into central Germany. Drop tanks extended range somewhat, but not enough for the deepest targets. The P-51 Mustang, with its long-range capability, had not yet fully transformed the air war. So bomber crews knew the pattern. Friendly fighters would peel away at a predetermined line. Beyond that line, the bombers continued alone. They called it the Long Mile. And during that mile, German fighters attacked with increasing confidence. Casualty rates in 1943 reflected the imbalance. On some missions, loss rates approached or exceeded 10%. Statistically, a crew needed to complete 25 missions to rotate home. At those rates, survival odds narrowed sharply. Crews understood the math. They also understood formation discipline was everything. When flak struck, when engines failed, when oxygen systems ruptured, the instinct to break away had to be suppressed. Staying in formation meant protection. Falling behind meant becoming a target magnet. On October 10, 1943, the target was Münster. The mission involved over 200 B-17s from the 8th Air Force. As they approached the target, heavy flak burst among the formations. German fighters, vectored precisely, closed in. Amid explosions and evasive turns, one portion of the formation drifted apart. 8 aircraft. Damaged. Slowed. But still flying in mutual support. To German radar controllers and fighter leaders, this was opportunity. A small cluster separated from the mass presented a manageable objective. Not an impenetrable wall of bombers, but a compact group that could be isolated and overwhelmed. Orders went out. Interceptors converged. And in the thin air above Münster, those 8 B-17s would soon face the full weight of a calculated German assault, an engagement that would test whether the theory of the flying fortress could survive reality. At 25,000 feet, the temperature outside a B-17 could fall below -40 degrees Celsius. Inside, it was not much warmer. Crew members wore electrically heated suits wired into the aircraft system. If the wiring failed, frostbite could set in within minutes. Oxygen masks were mandatory above 10,000 feet. At altitude, a damaged line could mean unconsciousness in less than 30 seconds. Each bomber carried 10 men. Pilot. Co-pilot. Navigator. Bombardier. Flight engineer/top turret gunner. Radio operator. Ball turret gunner. 2 waist gunners. Tail gunner. Most were in their early 20s. Training had been rigorous, but no stateside exercise replicated the sound of 20mm cannon shells ripping through aluminum skin. No instructor could reproduce the concussion of flak bursting close enough to rock a 40,000-pound aircraft sideways. When the larger formation fractured over Münster, the men inside those 8 aircraft felt the shift immediately. The sky seemed wider. Quieter. The sense of protection thinned. In a tight formation, gunners saw friendly wings only yards away. They felt enclosed by shared firepower. Now, space opened between aircraft. Each gap looked like vulnerability. The ball turret gunner, suspended beneath the fuselage in a cramped sphere barely larger than his body, had perhaps the most exposed position. If the landing gear could not deploy later, he might have to be pulled out mid-air before landing. If the turret jammed, he could become trapped. Waist gunners stood at open windows, cold air blasting inward. They tracked incoming fighters with practiced motions, firing short bursts to avoid barrel overheating. Spent casings clattered underfoot. In the cockpit, the pilot and co-pilot maintained formation spacing with minute adjustments of throttle and trim. Too close, and collision risk increased. Too far, and defensive overlap weakened. Fear existed. But it was controlled. Training reinforced one truth: the formation was survival. If one aircraft began to lag due to damage, the others adjusted. Speed was set by the slowest bomber. No one abandoned the box unless physically forced out. Over Münster, that discipline became the only shield these men possessed. The combat box was more than proximity. It was geometry. Aircraft were arranged in staggered vertical and horizontal tiers. High squadron. Low squadron. Lead elements offset slightly. This stacking allowed dorsal turrets to cover upper arcs while ball turrets protected lower approaches. Tail gunners guarded 6 o'clock positions. Nose and cheek guns swept forward sectors. The 8 aircraft that remained together after the fragmentation did not simply fly side by side. They tightened. Spacing compressed to maintain interlocking fields of fire. Pilots adjusted position to ensure no blind arc remained uncovered for long. If a fighter approached one bomber from head-on, gunners from adjacent aircraft could fire into the same airspace. This overlapping fire created a zone of converging tracers. German pilots described it as flying into a storm of steel. However, a smaller formation meant fewer guns. Instead of dozens of aircraft projecting hundreds of defensive barrels, now there were only 8 bombers, roughly 100 guns combined, assuming none were disabled. The defensive perimeter shrank. But it also became denser. With fewer aircraft to coordinate, visual contact improved. Pilots could maintain tighter cohesion. Gunners had clearer sectors of responsibility. The success of such a small box depended on discipline. No sudden evasive maneuvers. No breaking formation in panic. Bombers were not designed for dogfighting. Sharp turns risked collision. Instead, they relied on steady flight, allowing gunners stable firing platforms. The Germans understood this constraint. That is why head-on passes were so dangerous. A bomber could not simply dive away. It had to hold course. So the engagement became a test of steadiness. The 8 B-17s over Münster had already endured flak. Some carried structural damage. Engines may have been running rough. Control surfaces might have been stiffened by shrapnel impact. Yet they held alignment. In doing so, they presented not 8 individual targets, but a single, compact fortress. From the Luftwaffe side, the site of a separated cluster was tactical opportunity. German ground controllers would have vectored fighters toward the slower group once radar plots revealed its reduced speed. Fighter leaders, often veterans of multiple campaigns, quickly assessed relative altitude and sun position. They preferred to attack out of the sun when possible. A typical interception might begin with rocket fire from distance. The 21 cm rockets, though inaccurate, could scatter formations. Even near misses forced gunners to track multiple threats simultaneously. After disruption, fighters closed in with cannon. Pilots aimed for engines. Fuel tanks. Cockpit glazing. A B-17 could survive heavy punishment, but a burning wing root or incapacitated pilot could force it down. The expectation was cumulative damage. Wave after wave. The Luftwaffe had used similar tactics successfully against larger formations. Against 8 bombers, the math appeared favorable. But German pilots also respected the B-17's durability. They had seen aircraft return with tails shredded, wings holed, fuselages torn, yet still flying. So the approach required coordination. Multiple attack axes. Short exposure. Quick climb away. The engagement forming over Münster would test both doctrines simultaneously, German interception efficiency and American formation resilience. Because once the fighters committed to the assault, neither side could disengage easily. And the next moments would begin to reveal whether 8 bombers were a weakness, or something far more stubborn. The B-17 was never the fastest bomber in the American arsenal. It was not the largest. It did not carry the heaviest payload. Its reputation came from endurance. The airframe was built around redundancy. Control cables were routed along multiple paths. Fuel tanks were self-sealing. Engines were spaced far enough apart that losing one did not immediately compromise lift symmetry. Crews were trained to feather a damaged propeller within seconds to reduce drag. Most critical was the defensive armament. By late 1943, the B-17G had introduced the chin turret beneath the nose, a direct response to deadly head-on attacks. 2.50 caliber machine guns, electrically powered, could now meet fighters approaching from 12 o'clock. This altered engagement geometry. German pilots could no longer rely on a relatively soft frontal arc. Each Browning M2 fired approximately 750 rounds per minute. The ammunition, armor-piercing, incendiary, tracer, was linked in belts that fed through flexible chutes. Sustained fire could overheat barrels, so discipline mattered. Short bursts. Controlled tracking. Conservation of ammunition. Against them, the Bf-109 and Fw-190 carried heavier cannon shells capable of explosive damage. A single 20 mm hit could tear through spars or ignite fuel vapors. But fighters were fragile compared to bombers. One well-placed .50 caliber burst could shatter a canopy, sever a coolant line, or disable a wing root. Technologically, it was not an uneven fight. It was a trade of exposure time. Bombers offered large targets but heavy defensive arcs. Fighters offered speed and striking power but had to enter lethal range to deliver it. Over Münster, that equation began to play out repeatedly. Formation integrity required more than aircraft capability. It required command under pressure. In a standard 8th Air Force mission, a lead bombardier controlled the bomb release for the entire formation. Navigation was centralized. Radio discipline minimized chatter to prevent confusion. When a formation fractured, leadership shifted from centralized structure to immediate cockpit judgment. The lead aircraft among the 8 would have assumed informal command. Its pilot maintained heading and altitude, becoming the visual anchor for the others. Any deviation risked ripple effects. Pilots communicated through brief radio calls or prearranged signals. But radio traffic was limited. German monitoring stations could intercept transmissions. Silence was often safer. Leadership meant restraint. The instinct under attack is to evade. To bank sharply. To dive away from incoming fire. But in a bomber formation, sudden movement endangered everyone. A pilot who jerked his aircraft out of position could collide with a wingman or open a defensive seam. So leadership manifested as steadiness. Holding altitude despite flak bursts. Holding heading during a head-on charge. Trusting gunners to repel attackers rather than trying to outmaneuver them. It was a different kind of courage, not aggressive, but controlled. The German fighter leaders also faced command pressure. They coordinated waves of attack, ensuring spacing between elements. A poorly timed pass could place one fighter directly in the line of fire of another. Communication had to be concise. Visual signals were common. Experience mattered. Both sides relied on drilled responses rather than improvisation. And in that structured discipline lay the thin margin between survival and collapse. Combat at altitude was isolating. No infantry lines. No terrain to hide behind. Just open sky. When fighters appeared, they seemed to materialize from nowhere, dots growing rapidly into armed machines. The first pass always carried shock value. Cannon shells striking metal produced a violent hammering sound. Plexiglass cracked. Warning lights flickered. Inside a B-17, the smell of cordite and hot oil mixed with oxygen flow. Crews were trained to compartmentalize fear. Each man focused on his assigned arc. The ball turret gunner watched beneath. The tail gunner scanned for trailing threats. The engineer monitored engine gauges even while firing from the top turret. Psychology influenced firing accuracy. A gunner who panicked might empty belts too quickly. A gunner who froze might hesitate a fraction too long. Survival required rhythm, track, lead, fire, adjust. German pilots faced their own psychological barrier. They had to fly directly toward a formation throwing hundreds of tracer rounds into the air. The visual effect alone was intimidating. Bright arcs converging. Streams crossing. Some Luftwaffe veterans later described the experience as flying into a furnace. The engagement over Münster would stretch this psychological tension across multiple attack waves. Each side waiting for the other to break. For a bomber to peel away. For a fighter to hesitate. But neither side yielded immediately. And as the bombers cleared the target area and turned for the long flight back toward the North Sea, the confrontation intensified, because this was the phase when the Luftwaffe pressed hardest, knowing escort fighters were still out of reach. What followed was not a single pass, but a sustained test that would define the mission. October 10, 1943. Late morning. The target was Münster, a historic city in western Germany, but in 1943, also a node in the Reich's military network. Rail yards. Industrial facilities. Infrastructure feeding the German war effort. More than 200 B-17s from the 8th Air Force crossed the Dutch coast and pressed inland. The bomber stream stretched for miles, arranged in combat boxes stacked across altitude layers. P-47 Thunderbolts escorted them part of the way, weaving above and beside the formation. Then the escorts turned back. Fuel limitations dictated the boundary. Beyond that invisible line, the bombers continued alone. German radar had tracked them since they crossed the North Sea. Jagdgeschwader units were already climbing. Anti-aircraft batteries around Münster were prepared. The first flak bursts appeared as black blossoms ahead of the formation. Timed detonations filled the altitude band with shrapnel. Bombers shuddered as fragments struck fuselage and wings. Oxygen lines were severed in some aircraft. Hydraulic systems leaked. One B-17 lost an engine before reaching the initial point. Still, the formation held. At 11:48 a.m., lead bombardiers began their bomb runs. On the bomb run, evasive action ceased. Bombers flew straight and level to ensure accuracy. It was the most vulnerable phase of the mission. German fighters chose that moment. Bf-109s approached from head-on, slightly above the formation's altitude. FW-190s followed from flanking positions. Cannon flashes blinked in the sunlight. Tracers streaked forward. The sky compressed into seconds. One B-17 near the front absorbed a direct 20mm strike to its nose. Plexiglass shattered. The bombardier was wounded. Another aircraft took hits in the left wing route, fuel vapor trailing behind it. A third lost its number 3 engine and began to lag. As bombs released and fell toward Münster, the formation began its turn away from the target. That turn required coordination. Aircraft in outer positions increased throttle to maintain spacing. Inner aircraft reduced power slightly to avoid compression. It was during this maneuver that fragmentation occurred. Flak bursts intensified during the turn. A near detonation beneath one bomber damaged its elevator controls. The aircraft dipped momentarily before recovering. In the process, spacing widened. Another B-17, already nursing engine damage, struggled to maintain climb power. Within minutes, a portion of the formation drifted beyond the protective envelope of the larger group. 8 aircraft. They were not intentionally detached. They were simply slower. Damaged. Slightly misaligned during the turn westward. German controllers noticed immediately. Radar plots revealed a cluster moving at reduced speed, trailing the main body. Fighter units were redirected. The objective shifted from mass disruption to focused elimination. The first concentrated wave came shortly after noon. For Bf-109's dove from high 12 o'clock. Their closing speed was extreme. Chin turrets and nose guns opened fire almost simultaneously. Tracers crossed in tight arcs. One fighter broke away trailing smoke. Another continued through the formation, cannon round striking the lead bomber's cockpit section. Inside that aircraft, the pilot felt the impact as a physical jolt. Warning lights flashed. The co-pilot checked engine gauges. Oil pressure fluctuating on engine 2. Behind them, the ball turret gunner reported fighters forming again. The 8 B-17s tightened their box. Altitude held at approximately 23,000 feet. Airspeed around 150 to 160 miles per hour indicated. Slow compared to fighters. Stable enough for defensive fire. A second wave approached from low 3 o'clock. FW-190s climbed into firing position, releasing 20 mm bursts into the formation's flank. Waist gunners responded with disciplined fire. One German aircraft rolled inverted and fell away, its canopy blown off. The engagement was no longer sporadic. It became continuous. For nearly 10 minutes, fighters cycled in and out. Ammunition counters ticked downward. Gunners changed belts. Pilots maintained heading westward, toward the Dutch coast and eventual Allied air cover. Then a direct hit changed the balance. One of the 8 B-17s, positioned slightly low in the formation, absorbed concentrated cannon fire into its starboard wing. Flames erupted near the inboard engine. The aircraft began to drop. For a moment, it appeared the formation would break to avoid collision. Instead, the remaining 7 held steady while the stricken bomber slid downward and back, its crew attempting to extinguish the fire. The Luftwaffe sensed weakness. More fighters assembled ahead. The interception was far from broken. And as the 8 bombers pressed west, engines strained and ammunition dwindled, the next phase of the battle would determine whether the small formation could survive the remaining distance, or whether German coordination would finally tear it apart. The 8 B-17s pressed on, their formation rigid despite damage and exhaustion. Each aircraft had been hit, some more than once. One carried a partially shattered tail turret. Another had flak perforations across the fuselage, the ball turret mangled but still operational. Engines strained, fuel leaked in thin streams, evaporating instantly in the thin air. German fighters regrouped, attempting another coordinated attack. From high above, 3 FW-190s descended in a shallow dive, aiming for the left flank. Tracers streaked toward the bombers, the explosive shells thudding into aluminum and ricocheting off armor plating. The lead pilot made only minor heading adjustments, maintaining the defensive box. Gunners tracked carefully, firing controlled bursts. Every fighter approaching the formation encountered a hail of .50 caliber fire from multiple angles. At 12:30, a head-on pass became critical. 2 Bf-109s accelerated toward the lead aircraft, closing at over 600 miles per hour. The nose and chin gunners locked on. Tracer streams converged, cutting the attacking fighter's visibility. One 109 broke apart under concentrated fire, spiraling into the clouds. The second was forced to veer off, trailing smoke. The formation held. German pilots attempted flanking maneuvers. FW-190s tried to slip under the B-17s, firing upward into weak points near the wing roots. Waist gunners, previously firing at opposing sides, rotated and engaged targets below and behind. Coordination between gunners was flawless, lines of fire crossed, creating an invisible barrier. One German aircraft clipped another in a misjudged attack, tearing off part of its wing and spinning out of control. Damage accumulated on the American bombers, but the cumulative effect was minimal in stopping them. Engines faltered under flak and cannon fire, oxygen systems leaked, and wounded crewmen endured bitter cold. Yet the 8 aircraft pressed west. Each man relied on training and instinct. Fear remained, but it was harnessed. By 12:45, after nearly 20 minutes of sustained engagement, the Luftwaffe realized the cost of continued assault. Several fighters had been lost, others damaged, and ammunition limited. The small formation, far below the expected loss ratio, had maintained a tight box, firing in coordinated arcs that made further attacks increasingly dangerous. The decisive moment came when the last wave of attackers attempted a combined head-on and flanking maneuver. Pilots of the B-17s anticipated the approach, shifting formation slightly while keeping spacing tight. Gunners held fire until targets entered optimal kill zones, then unleashed short, precise bursts. Within moments, 2 more German fighters went down in spirals of smoke, their pilots ejecting or crashing. Others broke off entirely, recognizing that sustained attacks were no longer viable. By 12:50, the engagement over Münster had ended for these 8 B-17s. The sky above and around them, once thick with attacking aircraft, cleared. The bombers had delivered their payload successfully, although each carried battle scars, punctured fuselages, shredded control surfaces, scorched engines, and wounded crewmen. But no aircraft was lost among them. This outcome was extraordinary. German interception tactics had been perfectly timed and executed. Radar tracking, fighter coordination, and head-on assault strategies were textbook examples of air superiority doctrine. Yet discipline, overlapping defensive fire, and leadership allowed 8 aircraft to survive where probability suggested otherwise. As they turned northwest toward the North Sea, heading for rendezvous with returning P-47 escorts, the battered group reflected the intersection of human courage, mechanical resilience, and tactical doctrine. Each crewman understood that their survival was not the result of luck alone, but of adherence to training, mutual support, and timing, the thin line between life and death in the skies over Nazi Germany. The successful defense of these 8 B-17s also had a larger implication. It demonstrated that even small, disciplined units could disrupt enemy planning, preserve valuable crews, and force the Luftwaffe to expend precious resources. The engagement would become one of those remarkable examples used in training manuals, proof that a combination of machine, formation, and human resolve could withstand overwhelming odds. In the next phase, the journey home would not be easy. Damage, fatigue, and wounded crewmen still posed threats. But the most acute danger, the concentrated interception over Münster, had passed. The formation survival would influence how bomber groups evaluated cohesion and defensive posture in subsequent deep penetration raids. The sky, once a death trap of intersecting tracers and cannon fire, became a corridor of cautious relief. 8 B-17s had held the line. And in doing so, they had broken a German fighter interception. The 8 B-17s limped westward, their aluminum skin scarred and engines strained, but intact. Crewmen counted hits, checked instruments, and tended to wounded colleagues. In one aircraft, the tail gunner's turret had been riddled with shell fragments, yet he had kept it operational, returning fire until the last fighter disengaged. In another, a waist gunner applied a field patch to a jagged hole in the fuselage, stopping an air leak that could have proved fatal at high altitude. Across the formation, men silently acknowledged what had occurred. They had survived an attack that, statistically, should have claimed at least some of their number. The fragility of life in the bomber stream was starkly evident. Several aircraft carried structural damage severe enough to alter handling, yet the pilots maintained tight formation discipline. Each minor adjustment, throttle, trim, rudder, became a matter of life and death. Reports filed after landing detailed the scope of the engagement. Each bomber had sustained multiple hits from 20 mm and .50 caliber rounds. Flak perforations were evident on wings and fuselage panels. Instruments had failed temporarily in some cases. Oxygen masks had frozen in the extreme altitude cold. Despite all this, every bomber returned to base. Casualties were limited to minor and moderate injuries, nothing fatal, remarkably. German pilots, meanwhile, assessed the cost of their failed interception. At least 4 fighters were lost, with several more damaged or forced to disengage. Their mission, intended to decimate a small bomber group, had been thwarted by precise defensive fire and formation cohesion. Reports circulated up the chain of command, emphasizing the unexpected resilience of even a minimal B-17 cluster. The event became a case study in the effectiveness of the combat box, even when applied to a much smaller number of aircraft. Normally, small groups were considered highly vulnerable. 8 bombers separated from a main formation should have been easy prey. But the combination of discipline, overlapping defensive arcs, and coordinated leadership turned vulnerability into strength. This engagement also highlighted the psychological dimension of air combat. German pilots reported being unnerved by the intensity and precision of the defensive fire. Several admitted post-war that attacking the small group had felt riskier than engaging the main formation, despite its larger size. The effectiveness of even a few well-positioned .50 caliber guns in a disciplined formation had changed the dynamic of that engagement. The bomber crews, for their part, gained confidence, tempered with awareness of luck and fate. They knew the next mission could be more costly, but surviving this encounter reaffirmed that training and cohesion could sometimes overcome overwhelming odds. It was a lesson that would echo through 8th Air Force operations for the remainder of the war. As the 8 aircraft crossed the Dutch coastline and linked up with returning P-47 escorts, the skies became relatively safer. Yet the mission remained a stark reminder. Daylight bombing was brutal, survival was never guaranteed, and even success came at a personal cost to those who had endured it. The survival of the 8 B-17s over Münster carried lessons far beyond the immediate crew experience. While the Luftwaffe had planned a textbook interception, its failure exposed vulnerabilities in German daylight air defense when faced with disciplined American formations, even small ones. The engagement illustrated that tactical precision, crew coordination, and overlapping fields of fire could neutralize numerical superiority. A principle that would influence bomber strategy in subsequent missions. 8th Air Force Command studied the incident carefully. Reports emphasized that strict formation discipline, especially during fragmented or damaged flight, could prevent the catastrophic losses seen in earlier raids. Lessons were incorporated into training and operational planning. Crews were drilled to maintain cohesion under flak and fighter attack, to trust overlapping defensive fire, and to prioritize the survival of the group over individual maneuvering. Leadership in the cockpit, whether official or assumed by the lead pilot, became recognized as crucial for minimizing casualties and maximizing mission success. On the German side, the engagement forced adjustments. Fighter commanders acknowledged that attacking even small, cohesive groups carried significant risk. Every aircraft lost was irreplaceable, as fuel shortages and pilot attrition strained the Luftwaffe. Tacticians reconsidered whether head-on assaults, once their most effective tactic, could be sustained against increasingly experienced American gunners. Additionally, the cost of repeated sorties against disciplined formations began to outweigh potential gains, contributing to the gradual attrition of Luftwaffe effectiveness over time. The broader mission outcomes reinforced these lessons. Münster itself was hit, with bombs destroying rail infrastructure and military storage facilities. Strategic objectives were met, but at the cost of exposing weaknesses in the American bomber stream and the constant danger faced by crews in daylight missions. The 8 B-17s, though a small segment of the larger force, demonstrated how disciplined defensive tactics could preserve both human life and airframes, ensuring the continued capacity of the 8th Air Force to conduct repeated raids into the heart of Germany. The story of this mission also had psychological consequences. Crew morale, already fragile after sustained losses in 1943, was bolstered. Stories of survival against overwhelming odds spread quickly through bomber groups, creating a sense that skill, preparation, and composure could counter numerical and tactical disadvantages. Conversely, Luftwaffe pilots became more cautious, understanding that even a seemingly vulnerable formation could inflict significant damage. Ultimately, the engagement over Münster reflected the interplay between technology, human skill, and tactical doctrine. B-17 design alone did not guarantee survival. German interception planning, though advanced, could not overcome the disciplined execution of formation flying and gunnery. Leadership and human resolve proved decisive, and these 8 bombers became a microcosm of how the air war over Europe would evolve. Precision, discipline, and cohesion often outweighed brute force, influencing both Allied and Axis operational thinking in the months that followed. As the battered but intact B-17s returned to England, they carried more than structural damage and fatigued crews. They carried a lesson written in metal and fire, one that would inform tactics, training, and strategy in every subsequent deep penetration daylight mission. The Luftwaffe had been tested, and, for these 8 aircraft, it had been broken. The survival of 8 B-17s over Münster was more than a tactical success. It was a testament to the synergy of human discipline, mechanical resilience, and strategic doctrine. In the thin, frigid air over Germany, amid tracer fire and exploding flak, men and machines had endured what should have been overwhelming odds. It revealed a fundamental truth of aerial warfare: technology alone is insufficient. The B-17's guns, armor, and engines provided the potential for survival, but without disciplined crews, precise formation flying, and steady leadership, that potential could easily have been wasted. Likewise, numbers, speed, and aggressive tactics on the part of the Luftwaffe could not guarantee victory against an opponent who understood the rules of engagement and executed them flawlessly. The episode also reflected the psychological dimension of combat. Fear, fatigue, and chaos were constants at 25,000 feet. Yet, focused minds and trained responses turned vulnerability into advantage. Each gunner, pilot, and bombardier became part of a living defensive system, where coordination outweighed panic, and trust in comrades outweighed instinct to flee. Strategically, the incident influenced doctrine. American airmen learned that even fragmented units could maintain operational integrity if they adhered to the principles of the combat box. German planners, by contrast, recognized that precision and bravery alone could not always overwhelm well-disciplined formations, prompting reassessment of tactics and resource allocation. Beyond tactics and technology, the story of these 8 B-17s carries a human resonance. It is a reminder that courage is measured not only in acts of heroism, but in steadiness under pressure, in trust between individuals, and in the relentless commitment to a shared purpose. It is a lesson of resilience, of adaptation, and of the thin margin that separates survival from catastrophe. In the sky above Münster, those bombers were more than aircraft. They were fortresses of human will. And in breaking the German interception, they proved that determination, precision, and unity could turn a desperate situation into a story of endurance, shaping not only a single mission, but the evolving narrative of the air war over Europe.